go into like creating these locations or palaces, because I think that's very critical for everyone really. For us as memory athletes, we have to create a lot when we have to when we train for these competitions, because we can't just use one palace or one location set to memorize 10 decks of cards. We need to create a lot more than that. So it makes sense for us as memory athletes to create more locations. But for students, that's where I think a lot of them get discouraged, because like, oh, do I have to have 1,000 locations or these memory palaces to memorize, say just my body or my how do you say it?
And
Anatomical
anatomical
structure, I think.
structures. Yeah.
Okay. Anatomical structure. Do I have to have all these palaces? So what would you guys answer to a question like that? Do I really have to spend hours and hours creating these locations, or can I just settle on one set location and then reuse those locations? What would you guys say to that?
So if it's something that we want to commit long term, we generally do not reuse locations. And that's just because, kind of back to the concept we were talking about, we want that place to retain that feeling, those concepts that we wanted to memorize. So we don't overwrite. In response to, oh, do I have to sit down and think of hundreds and thousands of palaces? We usually say it's easier than you think it is, because there's just so many places, right? Like that you've been and and it doesn't even have to be, actually accurate. You just have to be able to think of it and think of the same loci every time.
Yeah. And quickly going back to some of the big quote unquote discoveries that we made about how to use the techniques. One of the big things that we do is we have a sort of a brainstormed list of palaces that we might want to use. So, we've gone back, some time ago and said like, okay, my home in Oxford, my home in Jackson, my, movie theater, libraries, whatever, and just kind of listed those out. But we don't really actually think of the loci within those palaces. So, we don't like for memory sports competitions and things, I know every single locus in every palace, and I built it that way specifically because that's how I want to use it in the competitions. But for a learning purpose, maybe if I'm learning pathology, I'll just pull up that brainstorm list and say, okay, I'm going to use my neighborhood right here for this first block of pathology, and then I'll start somewhere and I'll just choose the loci in the moment as I'm learning the material based on what I think is worth knowing in that area. So like, maybe I'm talking about acute inflammation, and there's like 5 main components of acute inflammation. So I'll use the house across the street and I'll do kind of one thing in each of that rooms of that house. And so we don't like, there's no palace building phase where we think of thousands of loci ahead of time. We just do it as we go through the material.
I think that's also useful because it lends kind of a natural flow to it. If I'm just kind of mentally plopping myself down, on our town main street, and I'm learning about cardiology, everything kind of flows from there as I'm walking down. It also goes with the way I'm kind of learning it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's also geographically located in my mind.
Yeah.
Got it.
It's helpful.
Okay. So it's not like, yeah.
Sorry, it's helpful. Just one last point. It's helpful for organization a lot, because we can, and this is this is one of the reasons we like to use palaces rather than just images, just links, is that we can use the palace to our advantage to organize the material. So, what I just said about, using the foregut, midgut, and hindgut in this room, if we want to, in the future, if we want to encode any kind of information about those things, then we can always come back to this specific room and think, okay, this room has got all the info we want to know about it. And in that way, we can make sure that the material is organized in a nice, tidy way.
So then at that point, will you guys, because Cathy, you said earlier that you don't like reuse locations, but would that be kind of the exception when you want to add on to the material already in that say palace or in that room?
Yeah. I wouldn't go back to the same locus per se, but I would find something else in there and add it in, or maybe have it interact with an image I already have existing, but not, overwriting it.
Right, exactly. So like if we were using the ceiling here for foregut, and then maybe there was another piece of info we wanted to add, we might come down and just use the window right here as another locus kind of in association with foregut.
And it's actually pretty easy because, it's like you can have multiple memories of things happening in your living room. And it's not like it overrides it, you can still remember it.
So, okay, let me kind of counter that a little bit. From my own experiences, meaning like I reuse these locations for like when I'm learning certain information. Like I think when I was memorizing the presidents, I reused a specific set of locations, and then I actually applied the periodic table of elements to that same route. So for me, I was able to distinguish the two because I knew, like, I don't know, I could kind of link them together. Like I knew if I saw a washing machine, right, I knew that it wasn't going to be hydrogen for the first element, meaning I wasn't going to confuse the element and the presidents. Have you guys actually like attempted to store multiple sets of different topics on, say, let's say right here, we'll stick with this example, the midgut and all that. Have you guys already attempted to store different things along, say, this specific route, or a route that you guys already used for a different piece of information, and then store something else? And then what was the outcome for that? Did you guys get, say, interference between the stories?
You know, I guess I'll take this one. So this is something that we adopted relatively early on, just based on kind of my personal experience in memory competitions. And I think, I can't remember any specific examples of really experimenting heavily with it, but my sort of initial feeling based on, my competition experience is just that if you want something to kind of stand on its own and really develop a feeling, like I said, of, like this place being the kind of foregut area, my feeling was that I wouldn't want to overwrite palaces. And that's not, it's certainly not to say that, like, like you said, obviously it can still work. We're not saying that it would never work if you overwrite palaces, but our thinking was that, okay, well, if we feel like we aren't going to run out of palaces and we're still going to have enough space, then why not? Why not not overwrite things?
And the other thing, oh, sorry, were you done?
No, go ahead.
I mean, the other two things was, people say med school is like drinking out of a fire hydrant, right? It's just like so much stuff all the time. And so it was definitely, I think, probably easier for us to just kind of go fresh, And then the other thing is, because we intend to use this information kind of in real time in the future, it's helpful for us, especially when we're taking tests and hopefully when we're seeing patients, to be able to scan through. And I think that would be easier for us to, say we have a patient with these symptoms, perhaps we can scan through more easily and see what everything that's there without trying to juggle that kind of, double images.
Right.
That makes perfect sense, and that's probably why I'm not in medical school right now, because I would probably just start stacking things on top of each other, and then when I need to like actually retrieve it, I'm like, wait, I have like 10 things on this one location. Which one was which?
Right.
But that's a good tip. Yeah, I did it just because I wanted, just for fun, to learn these things. So,
Right.
So it wasn't like, oh, I was gonna be quizzed on it or whatnot. But cool, good tips there. So
if I could add one more thing,
so we have
real quick, just to wrap it up, just to kind of support what you were saying. One actually thing that I do is, I also use a lot of the same palaces to learn Chinese, and so that was kind of a mistake of mine early on. Is that I made these very kind of large locations to learn various Chinese tones and things, and so, because those were so large, I ended up overlapping a lot of the medical stuff I was learning onto those same palaces. And I actually have found that it's usually not too big a problem of those palaces interfering, even though they're in the same place. And I think part of that is kind of going back to what you said, which is just when you're kind of in the, let's say the Chinese mode, the Chinese images just seem to kind of come to you and the medical ones sort of fade away. You know what I mean?
They're different enough.
Right.
And then another one of my theories about that is that for the Chinese ones, a lot of those images are on loci that are, I've just sort of developed a slightly different way of seeing them. So when I saw, say, like this fountain for medicine, I'm using like a particular angle, a particular feeling associated with that fountain. And maybe, I was using a slightly different angle, looking at it from the other side for Chinese or something. And so the difference between those two is enough that there's not really much interference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it perfectly does. Yeah, so, okay, it's another thing. I know we're kind of deviating a little bit from what we wanted to get into, but I mean, these are questions that people always ask.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, well, I have one more along this line of what you just said, which it's perfectly fine to kind of see locations from different angles, because that was one of my biggest hiccups when I was first starting off, even just like memorizing cards, right? I would memorize a card on a location. Let's say it was the chair, the chair I'm sitting on. And I would say store it up on top of here, and then when I finish the 52 cards, I would come back to this one to try to recall it, and I would be looking, say, at the armrest instead of like looking here when I was retrieving it. I was like, I have no clue what I stored on there, right? Did I even store anything on there? But it was just because I was seeing that location from a different angle, right? So I didn't know that, like, when you're recalling, make sure like to see it from the same angle that you memorize it in. Have you guys encountered anything like that? Well, you just gave it a perfect example. Or any other examples where you're like, when you're like recalling information, like, does the viewing of the way you see the location, does that affect the recall at all for you?
Well, as a non-professional competitor in this conversation, I think Alex does a lot of things where he will put them kind of small, not to scale. Does that make sense? Kind of like what you said, right on top of the chair. So everything I do is more, I guess, more to scale. And so I don't think I really have that problem, but maybe I have, and I can't think of it. But, I rarely put things on like a tiny like little person, just on an armrest, right? Because it's just easier for me to kind of, to create it so that it's more something like a memory of mine and not some sort of like weird little thing. But I know Alex does it differently. But for me, as a non-competitive person, that's kind of the trick that I found that helps.
Yeah.
So you use the entire place.
If I'm using the desk, I'm not going to like just
put it at the little corner.
I'm going to have an elephant like right here at the desk. So it's a little easier.
Yeah. My experience is actually for medicine is quite similar to Cathy's, I think, where because I'm not using places that I use over and over again, like in memory sports, I usually just tend to pick kind of bigger objects and not really focus on small things. And so things tend to be more to scale, and I have that problem less. But for memory sports specifically, like you just said, that's a huge problem for me, or not a huge problem anymore, but it used to be. Because so my conclusion was that basically every time I see a locus, I always see it from the exact same angle. And that's just something that's sort of developed, throughout my experiences. Practice is just I have to see those same loci from the same place, same angle, and that is the case for those.